The helicopters came without warning. Two Black Hawks dropped hard onto the rooftop of Harlow Creek Medical Center at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning. Rotors screaming, downdraft shattering a row of skylights over the pediatric ward. Armed operators in full tactical gear hit the stairwells before the glass stopped falling. They moved fast, room to room, floor to floor, with the kind of precision that didn't belong inside a hospital. Patients pressed against their beds. Nurses flattened against walls. A surgeon dropped his coffee and put both hands up without being asked. Team leader reached the emergency department in 40 seconds. He walked past the hospital director, past the chief of staff, past every doctor in the room. He stopped in front of a blonde nurse in plain blue scrubs, holding a wound irrigation syringe. "Nora Mercer," he said, "we're out of time. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the stories on this channel don't slow down and you cannot afford to miss what's coming next. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has already traveled. Now, let's go back to where it started. Harlow Creek Medical Center sat at the edge of a mid-sized city in eastern Oregon, the kind of place that looked impressive on a brochure and ran on exhaustion in practice. 12 floors, 430 beds, a level 2 trauma designation that the administration loved putting in press releases and the nursing staff loved ignoring because it mostly meant more patients with fewer resources. Building itself was 15 years old and showed its scuffed linoleum in the service corridors, elevator doors that required a second press to register, a heating system that facilities had been promising to recalibrate since the previous winter. Parking structure across the street had a broken gate arm that had been zip-tied into the open position. For so long, the zip ties had faded from black to gray. Nobody came to Harlow Creek because it was the best option. They came because it was the only option within 40 miles. Nora Mercer arrived on a Monday in February. She came with a single reference letter, a background check that cleared without flags, and a transfer file that listed her previous employer as a regional clinic in Montana. Human Resources processed her in under an hour of perfunctory review, the kind that happened when a department was short-staffed, and the applicant's paperwork was technically complete. She was assigned to the trauma wing, 3rd floor, Tuesday start. Nobody looked twice at her. She was 34, medium build, with blonde hair she kept pulled back tight and a manner so quiet it registered as invisible in a busy department. She didn't introduce herself loudly or attempt to build relationships in the first hour this way some new hires did, that performance of warmth designed to establish early goodwill. She found her locker, changed into scrubs, and clocked in 7 minutes early. The locker room smelled like antiseptic and reheated food, and the bench had a diagonal crack across the middle that someone had covered with electrical tape. She sat on the undamaged side, laced her shoes left foot first, double-knotted both, and went to find the charge nurse. Small habits. She had learned a long time ago that small habits were the architecture of reliability. The charge nurse on the 3rd floor was Diane Pollard, 22 years in the trauma department, heavyset, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead, and the clipped efficiency of someone who had stopped having patience for inefficiency somewhere around year 14 and hadn't looked back. She handed Nora a patient assignment list without preamble. Beds 4 through 11. Vitals 2 hours overdue on 6 and 8. Dr. Ashworth has a standing order on 9 that nobody's touched. And before you ask, supply room is on your left. Break room is at the end of the hall, and I don't have time to walk you through anything. Questions get answered by doing the job. Understood, Nora said. Diane paused. She had been braced for the follow-up questions. Where exactly? Which doctor? What kind of order? The standard new hire friction that required hand-holding and consumed the first hour. Instead, the new nurse picked up the list, glanced at it once, and walked toward bed 4. Diane watched her go. Then she went back to her charting. The first patient was a man named Gerald, 47, admitted the previous night for chest pain. that turned out to be a strained intercostal muscle and nothing more. He had the television remote in one hand and a breakfast tray in front of him that he hadn't touched. He looked at Nora with the expression of someone who had been waiting to be annoyed. Finally, he said, "Good morning. I'm Nora. I'm going to run your vitals, and then we'll talk through the discharge process. I've been sitting here since midnight. I know. I'm sorry about the wait." She was already applying the blood pressure cuff, smooth, practiced, no wasted motion. Night shift was running short. "You weren't the only one who got pushed back." He watched her, recalibrating slightly. She hadn't apologized with the hollow brightness that hospital staff sometimes deployed, the customer service version of sorry. She'd said it plainly, like a fact, and moved on. "My back's still bothering me. That'll ease over the next couple days. I'll make sure your discharge paperwork has a follow-up protocol included." She checked his blood pressure, then placed 2 fingers against his wrist for a manual pulse check, not redundant, just more complete. The monitor measured rate. Her fingers measured quality. Different information. "Any allergy to ibuprofen?" "No. We'll get you something before you go." She moved to bed 5. By noon, she had completed every overdue vital, caught a medication entry error. On bed 9, a Percocet order that a night resident had keyed in without flagging an existing sedative in the patient's regimen, combination that would have caused respiratory depression within the hour, and repositioned a patient in bed 11 who had been placed at an angle that would have generated a pressure wound inside 48 hours. She did none of it loudly. She didn't stop anyone to report it or request acknowledgement. She updated the charts, flagged the relevant attending, and moved to the next task. Diane Pollard, at the nurse's station, watched more than she appeared to. Dr. Marcus Ashworth arrived at 12:30. He was the senior attending on the trauma floor and functioned at the specific frequency of a man who had been the most capable person in most rooms he'd entered for the past 20 years, and had fully internalized that as a permanent condition. 51, trained somewhere he mentioned often, possessed of the kind of precision that made him good at his job and difficult to work beside, came to the station, picked up the bed 9 chart, and read the correction. Who flagged this? Diane tilted her head toward the far end of the corridor. New hire, Mercer. Ashworth read the full entry twice. He set the chart down. She catch the sedative overlap on her own, or did someone pull the secondary med list for her? On her own, he made a sound non-committal, somewhere between acknowledgement and withholding judgment, and walked to his next patient without another word. Nora, 6 feet down the hall, heard every word. She kept writing. The problem with being overlooked, and Nora had been overlooked in enough environments to understand its mechanics, was that people confused it with being unaware. They thought that because you weren't visible, you weren't watching. That because you didn't speak, you weren't thinking. It was a useful misunderstanding. She had never corrected it. On her 3rd day, she noticed the badge reader. North Service entrance, ground floor. A utility-grade magnetic lock with a keypad and card reader mounted at shoulder height. The LED indicator was supposed to go solid green on a successful read. Instead, it flickered yellow for a half second, then green, then the click of the lock. Most people swiped and pushed without registering the light color. She registered it on her first pass through that corridor and confirmed it on the second. She mentioned it to facilities on her way out. The man at the desk, Travis, had the look of someone whose work order queue had achieved a kind of philosophical permanence things that would always be pending and never be completed. "I'll get a work order in," he said. "What's the lead time on something like that?" "Depends on the queue. Roughly." He shrugged. "Week, maybe 2. She nodded and went to her car. On her 5th day, she stayed late to finish a chart. Walking back from the supply room at the end of the hall, she passed the facilities, office door open. Lights on, nobody inside. Miss Allison. The daily access log was pinned to a corkboard just visible from the doorway, the kind of document that didn't carry a security classification, because nobody had thought carefully about what it contained. She stood in the doorway for less than a minute. A supply delivery had been logged at 2:18 in the morning, not unusual. Hospitals ran supply chains around the clock. What was unusual was the cargo elevator runtime. 11 minutes for a delivery listed as medical consumables. Standard consumable drops ran 3 to 4 minutes. 11 minutes indicated either a significantly larger volume than the manifest recorded, multiple floor stops, or something else. She memorized the timestamp, the manifest code, the elevator ID, and walked to her car. On her 8th day, she noticed Dale Sutter. He appeared in the hospital contractor directory as a biomedical equipment specialist, external vendor, assigned to equipment, maintenance, and calibration on floors 2 through 4. His badge was valid. His lanyard was standard issue. He moved through the building with the fluid ease of someone who had already internalized its layout, not learning it, not consulting directories, not pausing at intersections. He knew where the stairs were before he reached the signage. He turned before the hallway markers told him to. Nora recognized that kind of movement because she had trained herself to do it. You built it from blueprints and repetition, from walking a space under supervision until the geometry lived in your muscle memory instead of your conscious attention. It was a deliberate skill. It belonged to a specific category of preparation. Access the contractor database through the nursing station. Terminal clinical staff had lookup permissions for equipment-related inquiries and pulled his file under the pretense of a ventilator calibration question. Everything was present: name, vendor ID, contact, certification dates, assigned equipment, all formatted correctly, all plausible at a glance. The credentialing body, listed for his biomedical certifications, didn't match the organization with licensing jurisdiction in Oregon. The identifier code was a single digit off from the correct one, the kind of discrepancy that failed a careful check and passed a casual one. Kind you would only catch if you already knew what the correct code should be. Printed the page, folded it, put it in her pocket. That evening, she went to see Conrad Briggs. Briggs ran hospital security from a first-floor office that had the feel of a space its occupant had stopped investing in. Filing cabinets with labels that had yellowed at the edges, a camera monitor showing a grid of feeds in varying quality, a desk that had accumulated enough paper to suggest the organizational system was largely aspirational. He was 58, former county law enforcement, and had arrived at hospital security work the way people arrived at a lot of things, through a combination of opportunity and reduced expectations. Nora sat across from him and laid out what she had. In order: the badge reader, the elevator log, the contractor credential. She kept it factual. She didn't editorialize. Briggs listened with the expression of someone hearing a presentation they had already decided the conclusion of. Badge readers malfunction, he said. Supply chains are irregular. Data entry errors happen in contractor files when organizations update their naming conventions and vendors don't sync. 3 separate anomalies in the same access corridor inside 10 days. Or 3 unrelated maintenance issues in a 15-year-old building. He set his pen down. I hear you, Miss Mercer. But I've got a full camera grid to review every shift and a security staff of 2. Can't open an inquiry based on a flickering LED and a delivery timestamp. Credential discrepancy takes 10 minutes to verify. He glanced at the printed page she'd placed on the desk. He didn't pick it up. I'll look into it. She held the moment, reading his face. He was not dismissive in the way that meant he disagreed. He was dismissive in the way that meant he didn't want the trouble of agreeing. Okay, she said, and stood. She left the page on his desk. Harlan Voss called her to the 10th floor the following morning. His office was a corner room with city views on 2 sides, and the careful aesthetic of someone who understood that someone environment communicated authority. 3 framed governance citations on the south wall, a credenza with a single orchid in a white pot, a desk kept clear enough to signal control. He was 61, silver-haired, and possessed the specific competence of an administrator who had survived 3 board reviews by managing perception more effectively than he managed problems. He asked her to sit. He folded his hands. Conrad mentioned your conversation, he said. I wanted to follow up personally, which I hope tells you how seriously we take staff concerns. I appreciate that. I also want to be direct, because I think you respond well to directness. He let that land before continuing. What you brought to Conrad, a badge reader with intermittent function, a delivery log with an irregular timestamp, a contractor file with a data entry error. Yeah. These are operational details that our teams track as part of normal protocol. You've identified things our systems are already designed to catch. With respect, the contractor credential has been noted and will be verified. The phrase closed that door cleanly. What I want to address is something broader. You're 11 days into your time here. By all accounts, you're doing strong clinical work. Diane said so, and she sets a high bar. Going around department structures, surfacing concerns that sit outside your clinical scope, creates friction that affects the whole floor. Staff here work hard. They don't need the additional stress of security concerns being raised without clear evidence. Nora looked at the governance citations. Back at Voss. I understand. Good. He stood and extended his hand across the desk. I'm glad we had this conversation. She shook his hand and left. In the elevator going down, she stood with her back against the wall and her eyes on the floor display, counting down. The meeting had produced exactly what she had expected it to produce. What she had learned from it was something Voss hadn't intended to communicate. He had said the credential would be verified. He had said it had been, which meant Briggs had gone upward, before going sideways, had reported her visit to administration, before completing even a basic check on the thing she'd reported. That sequencing was interesting. That sequencing meant something. Frank Odell arrived in bed 7 on her 11th day. 63 years old, admitted through the emergency department with 2 cracked ribs on the left side and a dislocated shoulder that had been self-relocated before the paramedics arrived. Intake note read, patient reports managing dislocation independently prior to EMS contact, method unclear. She read that as he'd done it before. Physical history on the form was sparse in the specific way that happened when someone had spent significant time in environments where detailed medical records weren't kept or weren't kept accurately. Came in on his second afternoon. He was sitting upright against the raised bed with the television off, watching the window. He had the build of someone who had been physically capable for decades and had no intention of renegotiating that arrangement simply because of 2 cracked ribs. She worked without speaking, first checked the rib guard seating, assessed shoulder mobility, documented his pain markers. He watched her hands the whole time with the deliberate attention of someone who evaluated people for a living and had not stopped. Pain level, she said. Not quite a question. Manageable. That's not a number. Brief pause. 4. You're splinting your breath when you shift left. Reads higher. 5.5. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite amusement, but the structure of it. She adjusted the pillow support under his arm. He tracked her right hand. You favor that shoulder when you compensate, he said. Old strain. Which side originally? She didn't answer. She was entering the pain documentation into the tablet. You're not a career hospital nurse, he said. Flat. Observational. The way a man who had spent years reading people in high-pressure situations stated something he'd already confirmed. I've worked in a variety of settings. That's a non-answer. Yes, she agreed. He accepted that without pushing it. Then, there's a man on this floor who doesn't belong. Pen stopped moving. Blue lanyard. Badge clipped at pocket level. Instead of the collar, that's not how contractors are briefed to wear them here. I checked the staff directory photo. Frank kept his voice level unhurried. He ran the south corridor twice yesterday afternoon. Same route, same pace, same direction. I had a window angle from imaging. 12 minutes between passes. Nora set the tablet on the tray table. Where did you lose him? Past the imaging suite junction. He knew that blind spot was there. He slowed before he reached the camera coverage, not after. Frank shifted carefully, keeping his ribs still. You already know who I'm describing. She picked the tablet back up. Rest tonight, she said. Don't push the shoulder range of motion before morning. She walked out. In the stairwell, she stopped on the landing between floors 3 and 4 and stood in the fluorescent quiet. Pulled the folded page from her pocket and read it again, though she had already memorized every line. Badge reader, elevator log, mismatched credential. And now, a man conducting timed reconnaissance passes of the South Corridor, wearing a contractor badge from a credentialing body that didn't exist in Oregon. Pulled out her phone. The contact had no name. A 3-digit prefix, a number she had kept for 3 years without using it, through 2 moves and a complete professional reinvention, because some information had a shelf life that outlasted your desire to hold on to it. She had not sent a message to this number in 14 months. She typed 6 words, Harlow Creek. Something is already inside. She watched the stairwell door. 41 seconds. How long do you need? She read it twice. Through the fire door, she could hear the 3rd floor working the layered ambient sound of a trauma department at its normal operating pace, call bells and rolling medication carts, and the particular fluorescent hum that belonged to every hospital she had ever worked in every context she had ever worked in them. She thought about the 11-minute elevator. She thought about Dale Sutter navigating the floor plan from memory. She thought about the inspection memo that Voss had distributed to all staff, 2 weeks senior personnel from a federal health oversight body, arriving in 6 days for an 8-hour facility review. Scheduled visit, protected individuals, known location, known timetable, documented point of entry. If someone wanted access to those people, this building was the architecture of that access. 48 hours, she typed, maybe less. The response came in 8 seconds. Understood. Keep your head down. She put the phone away and pushed through the stairwell door. At the far end of the South Corridor, something moved a flash of blue lanyard, catching the fluorescent light for 1 second before disappearing around the service junction corner. She stood in the hallway and watched the empty space where he had been. Then she turned and walked back to her patients. She kept her pace even, kept her face neutral. She was very good at both of those things. Behind her, on a monitor in the facilities office on the 1st floor, a monitor that Travis had not looked at in the past 90 minutes, the cargo elevator log from 12 days ago quietly rearranged itself. Timestamps corrected. Duration normalized. Manifest updated to resolve the discrepancy she had flagged. Every field aligned. Every number coherent. Every trace of the irregularity removed. Edit was timestamped 6:52 p.m. It had been made from a terminal inside the building. Someone had found out she was looking, and instead of running, they had cleaned the evidence and stayed exactly where they were. She went home that night and didn't sleep. Not insomnia exactly. She had trained herself out of insomnia years ago in environments where not sleeping was a liability that got people killed. This was something different. This was the specific wakefulness of a person who had identified a problem they couldn't hand off and couldn't ignore, lying in the dark running variables. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building 6 blocks from the hospital. She had chosen it for that reason, walking distance. Without being adjacent, close enough to respond fast if she needed to, far enough to maintain the appearance of a clean separation between her professional and personal life. The apartment itself was functional and nearly empty. A bed, a small table, 2 chairs, a kitchen she used for coffee, and not much else. She had hung nothing on the walls. After 14 months, she still hadn't decided whether that was temporary or permanent. She lay on top of the covers with her eyes open and worked through what she had. The badge reader was still unrepaired. She had checked on her way out, flickering yellow, half-second delay, same as day 3. Travis's work order had either not been submitted or not been prioritized, which in a building this size meant it could sit for weeks without anyone tracking it to resolution. The North Service entrance was the least monitored access point on the building's ground floor. Camera coverage, there was a single fixed unit with a 40-degree field, leaving a blind approach from the parking structure side. The elevator log was gone. Whatever it had shown was now corrected, sanitized, and filed as compliant. She had no copy. She had memorized the entry, but memorized information wasn't evidence. And she was not in a position to explain to anyone how she knew what she knew about interpreting access logs. Dale Sutterfer was still in the building. She had confirmed it at the end of her shift. His badge had logged an exit at 5:44 p.m. through the east entrance, which was normal. What was not normal was that the east entrance camera, which she had checked through the nursing station's limited access monitor, had shown no corresponding visual of anyone matching his description at that timestamp. Either the log had been manipulated or the exit had been staged, and the inspection was in 5 days. She rolled onto her side and looked at the window. The city outside was the particular dim orange of a cloudy night with streetlights beneath it. She thought about the 6 words she had sent and the 8-second response she had received, and she thought about what 48 hours meant in practical terms. And she thought about whether 48 hours was going to be enough. She got up at 4:30, made coffee, and went back to work 2 hours before her shift started. She used the early time carefully. The 3rd floor was quietest between 5 and 6 in the morning night shift, winding down, day shift not yet arrived, a narrow window when the corridors had enough foot traffic to make her presence unremarkable and not enough to make her movements observed. She walked the south corridor twice at different paces, counting ceiling tiles, noting camera positions, identifying the blind spots that Dale Sutter had already mapped. He had good instincts. The south corridor had 2 camera gaps, one near the imaging suite junction, 18 feet of unmonitored floor, and one near the service stairwell door at the far end, where the mounting bracket had been angled 3 degrees too far left to cover the door handle. She knew that second gaps because she had spent the first week unconsciously cataloging every camera on her floor, the way she cataloged everything, not deliberately, just thoroughly, because thoroughness was how she was built. The stairwell door at the south end connected to a secondary service shaft that ran parallel to the main stairwell. It was used primarily by facilities staff for equipment transport, connected at the basement level to the loading dock and the tunnel that ran under the east parking structure to the hospital's auxiliary power building. She stood at the stairwell door for a moment, then went upstairs to start her shift. At 7:15, Dr. Ashworth arrived and found her at the nurse's station updating morning vitals. "Mercer," he set his bag down. "I'm adding a post-op monitoring protocol to beds 6 and 9 this morning. I need hourly neuro checks through noon." "Already on the board," she said, not looking up. "I added them at 6:50 based on yesterday's discharge notes." A pause. "On whose authority?" "The standing order you put in last Tuesday covers neuro-monitoring continuation for any patient with a head-impact admission in the prior 72 hours. 6 and 9 both qualify." Another pause longer. She looked up. Ashworth was reading the board with the expression of a man recalculating something. "Fine," he said. He picked up his bag and walked to his first patient. Diane Pollard, at the far end of the station, said nothing. But Nora caught the slight shift in her posture. Something settling, something reassessed, and filed it away. By 9 o'clock, the floor was running at full capacity. 2 admissions from overnight had added beds, 12 and 13, to the active roster, and a patient in bed 3 was deteriorating in a way the night resident had documented, but not escalated. Nora caught it on her morning review oxygen saturation, trending down over 4 hours in increments, small enough to miss on a single reading, significant enough to matter across the window. Called the attending directly, bypassing the resident, Dr. Ashworth. Bed 3, Mrs. Paulson, sat trending from 96 to 91, over 4 hours. Night notes document it without escalation. "I think she needs imaging. What's her current presentation?" "Compensating. Slightly elevated respiratory rate, using accessory muscles on deep breath. She's masking it well." 3 seconds of silence. "I'll be there in 2 minutes." She was right. A small pulmonary embolism, caught early enough to treat without crisis. Ashworth ordered the imaging, reviewed the results, and had a treatment plan in place by 10:30. He said nothing to Nora about it directly. But at the nurse's station, when Diane asked him a question about a separate patient, he answered it and then said, without transition, "Mercer's clinical instincts are sound," and walked away. Diane looked at the doorway he'd disappeared through. Then she looked at Nora. Nora was writing a chart entry and appeared not to have heard. She had heard. At 11:20, she saw Dale Sutter on the second floor. She had gone down to retrieve a piece of equipment from the floor to supply cache, a task she had volunteered for, specifically because it took her past the South Corridor junction onto the location Frank Odell had described from his imaging window. She was not hurrying. She had a legitimate reason to be there, and she moved at the pace of someone who did. He was at the far end of the corridor, crouched near a wall-mounted equipment panel, with a tablet in one hand and a small diagnostic tool in the other. His posture was correct for a biomedical tech, focused, grounded, angled toward the panel. His badge was visible. His lanyard was straight. But the panel he was working on housed the fire suppression monitoring relay for the south wing of Floor 2. That system was managed by a dedicated facilities contractor under a separate service agreement, which she knew because she had read the vendor list on the facilities corkboard on day 5. A biomedical equipment specialist had no professional reason to be interfacing with fire suppression monitoring hardware. Kept walking. She did not slow down. She did not look at him longer than a person moving through a corridor would naturally look at a contractor doing maintenance work. She picked up her equipment from the supply cache, signed the retrieval log, and took the main stairwell back to 3. In the stairwell, she pulled out her phone. The response to her previous message had said 48 hours. It had been 19. She typed, "Accelerate if possible. Asset accessing building systems beyond scope. Fire suppression relay, floor 2 south." She waited. 12 seconds. Confirmed. Do not engage. Do not move position. She put the phone away and went back to her patients. The problem arrived at 2 in the afternoon in the form of Conrad Briggs walking onto the 3rd floor with the expression of a man who had been given an assignment he found distasteful. He came to the nurse's station and asked for Nora in a voice he kept deliberately casual, which meant the conversation was not going to be casual. She was in bed 8 when Diane relayed the message, finished what she was doing, adjusted the IV flow rate, noted it, capped her pen and walked out. Briggs was standing near the hallway junction, hands in his jacket pockets, not quite making eye contact when she approached. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation earlier this week," he said. "Okay. Director Voss and I have reviewed the items you flagged." He cleared his throat. "The badge reader is scheduled for replacement next week. The delivery log discrepancy was a data entry correction that facilities has already resolved, and the contractor credential, Dale Sutter, checks out. The organization name was updated 18 months ago, and our database hadn't been synced. Verified directly with the vendor this morning." She looked at him. "You verified with the vendor?" "Correct. Not with the licensing body." A beat. "The vendor confirmed his certification is current and valid." "That's not the same verification." His jaw tightened slightly. "Ms. Mercer, I'm telling you the concerns have been reviewed and resolved. I'm also telling you, and I want to be clear about this, because Director Voss asked me to be clear that continued escalation of security matters outside your clinical role is going to create a problem for your position here. That's not a threat. It's a professional courtesy." She held his gaze for 2 full seconds. "I understand." "Good." He nodded, something releasing in his shoulders. "That's all I needed." He left. She stood in the corridor and breathed slowly through her nose. The vendor confirmation meant someone had called the vendor. The vendor had confirmed. Which meant the vendor contact, whoever answered that call, was either legitimately unaware, which was possible, or was part of the same operation, which was also possible. Either way, Briggs had taken the path of least resistance and called it resolved. Behind her, from the doorway of bed 7, Frank Odell's voice came low and even. That looked unpleasant. She turned. He was propped in the doorway in his hospital gown, one hand on the frame, watching her with the unhurried attention he brought to everything. "You should be resting," she said. "I've been resting for 2 days. Becoming its own kind of injury." He tilted his head toward the direction Briggs had gone. Security, hospital administration. Same difference in a place like this. He studied her face. They told you to drop it. She didn't answer. And you're not going to, he said. She walked toward him. Get back in bed, Mr. Odell. I need to check your shoulder mobility before the evening shift. He moved aside to let her through and sat on the edge of the bed. She assessed the shoulder range of motion, resistance, swelling, and noted the improvement with the focused detachment she brought to clinical work. He let her work without interrupting. Then, when she was making her notation, the guy with the blue lanyard was on this floor this morning. Before 6. Her pen slowed. I was awake early, Frank said. Couldn't sleep with the rib pain. He came through the north end around 5:20, spent about 4 minutes near the electrical access panel by the linen room, and left through the south stairwell door. Did he see you? I was in the bed. Lights off. Window lit. He paused. He didn't look in. She finished her notation. The electrical panel by the linen room controls the backup power relay for the nursing station systems on this floor. I know what it controls. His voice was steady. I looked it up on the floor directory map this morning. She looked at him. He looked back. Who are you? She asked. A retired man with 2 cracked ribs who doesn't sleep well. That's a non-answer. Yes, he said it is. She almost smiled. Almost. Rest your shoulder. She walked out. The inspection briefing was held at 4 o'clock in the hospital's main conference room on the 8th floor, decud floor. Attendance was mandatory for department heads, senior nursing staff, and anyone with a role in the facility review process. Nora had not been included in the original invitation. She was 12 days into her tenure, well below the seniority threshold. But Diane Pollard had added her that morning without explanation, listing her under trauma floor clinical support. She sat in the back row. Harlan Voss ran the briefing with the polished ease of someone who had done this enough times that it required no preparation. The visiting delegation was scheduled to arrive in 4 days. Federal health oversight, facility certification review, standard protocol. The visit would include a full tour of the trauma and surgical wings, a review of patient outcomes data, and a formal presentation in the 8th floor conference room. Voss named the lead delegate. Nora recognized the name. Not from the news, not from some sources, from a briefing document she had read in a different building, in a different life, 3 years ago. Kind of briefing that happened in rooms with no windows and no recordings. The delegate wasn't just a federal health official. He was a former deputy administrator of a security-adjacent oversight body, currently serves in a civilian capacity that required a level of protection most people in this room would never know about. Kept her face completely still. Voss was still talking logistics, parking protocols, staff conduct expectations. She heard the words without processing them. She was calculating. The delegate's name was on a public memo, which meant anyone who had been paying attention to this hospital's federal affiliations in the past 6 weeks, anyone who had done the kind of research that required access and patience would know who was coming and when. Pulled out her phone under the table and typed, "Name on inspection memo matches. This is the target. 8 seconds. Copy. Escalating. Hold position." She put the phone away. At the front of the room, Voss wrapped up the briefing with the standard language about the hospital's commitment to excellence and the importance of presenting their best work. Staff filed out. Nora stayed in her seat until the room thinned, then stood and walked to the door. She nearly ran into Marcus Ashworth in the hallway. He was coming out of the adjacent room, reading something on his phone, and pulled up short when she stepped through the door. They were close enough that she could see the slight tension in his jaw before he reset it. Mercer. He glanced at her, then at the conference room she'd come out of. "You were in the briefing?" Diane added me. He pocketed his phone. He seemed to be working through something. "The Paulson catch this morning." "Yes, that was good work." He said it the way a person said something they'd been thinking about how to say. Not a compliment, exactly more of an acknowledgement that he'd been carrying for 6 hours and finally set down. The night team documented the saturation trend, but didn't weight it. You did. It was there in the chart. A lot of things are there in the chart. He paused. You have clinical instincts that aren't typical for someone at your experience level, or at least the experience level your file suggests. She met his eyes. I've worked in high acuity environments. Where? Places that moved fast. He studied her for a moment. He was smart not just medically, but observationally, the way some people were who had spent long enough watching others perform under pressure that they could identify the edges of a person's actual capability. She could see him reaching for something he couldn't quite place. The inspection, he said, shifting. Voss has everyone performing. You should know that the clinical presentation during the tour is going to be watched carefully. I'll be focused on my patients. That's the right answer. He said it like he meant it. It's also the answer that tends to get people like you overlooked. She held his gaze. That's not always a disadvantage. He blinked. Then, slowly, something in his expression shifted, not quite understanding, but the beginning of it. He nodded once, picked his phone back up, and walked down the hall. She watched him go. That evening, she found the transmitter. She hadn't been looking for it. Specifically, she had been in the medication room on the north end of the floor, retrieving a controlled substance for a patient in bed 10 when she noticed the discrepancy. The medication room had a secondary power outlet behind the crash cart, the kind of low-profile outlet that existed for equipment charging and was typically obscured by the cart's base. She moved the cart 6 inches to access the outlet, and behind the cart, adhered to the baseboard with a strip of industrial adhesive, was a device roughly the size of a thick thumb drive. She did not touch it. She looked at it for 4 seconds, matte black casing, a micro antenna along one edge, a small indicator light that was not lit but showed a faint residual charge, and then she moved the cart back to its original position with the same careful, unhurried motion she'd used to move it in the first place. She retrieved the medication. She administered it. She updated the chart. Then she walked to the stairwell, stood on the landing between 3 and 4, and typed, "Transmitter device, medication room north, 3rd floor, behind crash cart, active capable, has not been triggered." The response took longer this time. 22 seconds. Do not remove. Do not flag internally. Can you maintain observation? She thought about the medication room. She was in there 4 to 6 times per shift. She had a legitimate clinical reason to enter it at any point. Crash cart was hers to manage as part of her floor assignment. "Yes," she typed. "Good. We are 18 hours out. Need you to hold the line." 18 hours. She did the math. That put the arrival at roughly noon the following day, which was 2 full days before the inspection. Early enough to establish position, late enough that she couldn't be certain what else had been placed in the building that she hadn't found yet. She stood in the stairwell for a moment longer than necessary, her back against the cold cinder block, and allowed herself 30 seconds of something she rarely permitted: the simple, unguarded acknowledgement that she was tired. Not physically. The other kind. The kind that came from being the only person in a building who understood the shape of what was coming and having no one to share the weight of that with. 30 seconds. Then she pushed the door open and went back to her floor. The night shift change happened at 7. She stayed through handoff, giving the incoming nurse, a steady, methodical man named Roy, a thorough briefing on each patient, including the Paulson update and the neurocheck schedule on beds 6 and 9. Roy listened carefully, asked 2 good questions, and took the handoff cleanly. She changed out of her scrubs at 7:40 and walked to the parking garage. In the elevator of the garage, she checked her phone. No new messages. She rode to the 3rd level, walked to her car, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The garage was nearly empty at this hour, the concrete columns casting long shadows under the sodium lights. She sat and let the quiet settle around her and thought about the transmitter behind the crash cart, about the fire suppression relay on floor 2, about a badge reader that still flickered yellow on the North Service entrance, about a cargo elevator that had run for 11 minutes and a log that had been cleaned before she could prove it, about Harlan Voss, who had assured her that everything was resolved, about Conrad Briggs, who had told her professionally, courteously, that continued escalation would create a problem for her position. She thought about the morning she had walked into this building for the first time, with a reference letter from a clinic in Montana and a background check that cleared without flags, and the way the human resources officer had processed her paperwork without once looking up from her screen. Started the car. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, not the contact she'd been messaging. A different number, 1, she recognized from a different category of her history, the kind of number that belonged to someone who moved through institutional structures rather than outside them, someone she had not spoken to in over 2 years. The message was 4 words. They know you're there. She stared at it. The garage was quiet. Somewhere below, a car door closed and an engine started, the sound bouncing off concrete and rising through the levels in a hollow, directionless echo. She typed back, "Who is they?" She waited. The response came in 40 seconds, and when it did, it was not words. Photograph. She enlarged it with 2 fingers. A security camera, still grainy. Timestamp in the corner from 2 hours ago, the angle suggesting a camera she hadn't identified, positioned somewhere on the 3rd floor she hadn't mapped. The image showed a corridor she recognized. The south end, near the stairwell door. In the frame, partially obscured by the edge of the doorway, was a figure she didn't recognize. Not Dale Sutter. Someone new. Broader through the shoulders, different posture, no lanyard visible. And in the foreground of the image, clear and unmistakable, caught in profile while writing on a tablet at the nurse's station, was her. Someone inside this building had been running their own surveillance, and they had footage of Nora Mercer that had nothing to do with the hospital's official camera system. She set the phone face down on the passenger seat, hands still, and looked through the windshield at the concrete wall of the parking structure. A water stain ran diagonally from a seam in the ceiling to a point just above the painted line of her parking space, spreading at the edges in the shape of a river delta. She picked the phone back up and typed to the first contact, the one with the 3-digit prefix. Timeline has changed. They have eyes on me inside the building. There is a second asset I have not previously identified. I need you here now. She waited. The response came in 6 seconds faster than any previous reply, fast enough that whoever was on the other end had been waiting for exactly this message. We're already moving. ETA 11 hours. Do not go back in tonight. She read it twice. Then she read the photograph again, and the time stamp in the corner, and she understood something she hadn't understood before. The image was from 2 hours ago from the corridor near the south stairwell. At the time, she had standing in exactly that location, reading a page she had folded and kept in her pocket since day 8. The second asset hadn't just been watching the building. He had been watching her specifically, which meant they hadn't identified her as a threat because she had been asking questions. They had identified her before she arrived. She didn't go home. The instruction had been clear, do not go back in tonight, but it hadn't said anything about the parking structure, and the parking structure had a line of sight to the hospital's north service entrance that she had cataloged on day 1, without knowing she would ever need it. She moved her car from the 3rd level to the 2nd to a space behind a support column that broke the sight line from the street while preserving her angle on the entrance below. She cut the engine and sat in the dark with the windows cracked 2 inches and watched. The north entrance ran quiet until 9:40. At 9:40, a facilities van she didn't recognize pulled to the service bay. No hospital logo on the side, just white panel, Oregon plates, a magnetic vendor decal that she couldn't read at this distance. 2 men got out. They moved a hand truck through the service bay door with the unhurried competence before in this building, and knew the north entrance badge reader give them a half-second window they didn't need to worry about. The badge reader flickered yellow. The door opened. She photographed it on her phone, long distance, poor light, barely usable, and sent it to the 3-digit contact with one line, north entrance. 9:42 p.m. Second asset, +1 unknown. Using the reader gap. No response for 4 minutes. Then, got it. Do not follow. 11 hours. She put the phone down and watched the entrance until the van left at 10:18. 26 minutes inside. Long enough to place equipment. Long enough to do a number of things she could not verify from where she was sitting. She drove home at 10:30, set an alarm for 5, and slept for 6 hours not well, but adequately, the practiced sleep of someone who had learned to take rest as a tactical resource rather than a comfort. She was back in the building by 5:50, an hour before her shift, wearing her scrubs and carrying a coffee she had bought at the gas station 2 blocks away. She badged in through the main entrance, not the north service door, and took the main elevator to 3. The floor was in the quiet transition between night and day. Roy was still at the Fulter station finishing his charting. 2 night nurses moving through final rounds, the overhead lights at their lower overnight setting. Nora said good morning to Roy, reviewed the overnight notes on her patients, and when the floor settled into its brief pre-shift stillness, she walked to the medication room. She moved the crash cart. The device was still there. Same position, same orientation, indicator light still dormant. She looked at it for 3 seconds, replaced the cart, and retrieved the medication she had come in for. Her hands were steady. She noted it to herself as a data point. Without judgment, the steadiness wasn't calm. It was compartmentalization, which was a different thing, and she had learned not to confuse the two. Back at the nurse's station, she pulled up the floor's camera access on the monitoring terminal, the limited view available to clinical staff, covering only patient room doors and the main corridor junction, and checked the timestamp logs for overnight activity. Nothing flagged. The south stairwell door had no camera coverage, which she already knew. The medication room had no camera, which she also knew. At 6:15, Diane arrived. She came in the way she always did, coat off. Glasses up, clipboard in hand, reading before she was fully through the door. Stopped when she saw Nora at the terminal. "You're early," Diane said. "I wanted to review the overnight notes before handoff." Diane looked at her for a moment, the particular look of someone who was revising an assessment they hadn't realized they'd been making. She set her clipboard down and poured herself coffee. "Ashworth mentioned you yesterday," she said. "I know. I heard him. He doesn't say that about many people." She paused, cup at her lip. "He doesn't say it about anyone, actually." Not in the way he said it. Nora kept her eyes on the terminal. "He's a good clinician. He's a difficult one. There's a difference." Diane sat down. "You've been on this floor less than 2 weeks, and you've already caught 2 things that could have gone badly and managed Ashworth without antagonizing him, which is something people with 5 years here haven't figured out." She drank her coffee. "I don't know what you came from before Montana, and I'm not asking, but whatever it was, it shows." Nora turned from the terminal. "I appreciate you adding me to the inspection briefing. You needed to be there." Diane shrugged, which was as close as she got to explaining herself. "The tour comes through this floor. You should know what's happening." The day shift arrived in intervals over the next 20 minutes, the floor's noise level climbing, as it always did, the institutional momentum of a busy department coming online, predictable as a tide. Nora took her assignment, checked her patients, and moved through the morning with the focused efficiency that had become, in less than 2 weeks, simply the way she functioned here. The 11 hours ran in the back of her mind like a second clock. At 8:50, Marcus Ashworth found her in the corridor outside bed 6 and said, without preamble, "Walk with me." She felt him to step beside him. He moved toward the quieter end of the hall, away from the nurse's station, and stopped thumb near the window at the north end that overlooked the service road. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," he said, in the hallway after the briefing. "I said several things. That not being visible isn't always a disadvantage." He looked out the window, not at her. "I've been in this hospital for 9 years. I know everyone on this staff well enough to predict how they'll perform on any given day. You're an outlier, not in a way I can quantify from your file." She waited. "The inspection concerns me," he said. "Not the clinical review. We're solid on outcomes. The security component. Voss has been managing optics on several operational issues this quarter that I'm aware of because I sit on the quality committee. Badge system failures. A contractor audit that got pushed back twice. He paused. I raised it at the last committee meeting, and Voss tabled it, kept her face neutral. What made you bring it up? Pattern. Small things that don't resolve. He turned from the window. You've noticed it, too. It wasn't a question. She looked at him carefully. Ashworth was smart, and he was observant. And he was, as far as she could assess him, not part of what was happening in this building. He was also, right now, a variable she hadn't accounted for. A person who had begun connecting threads independently and was standing in a corridor asking her questions that she couldn't answer without explaining things she wasn't ready to explain. I've noticed some operational irregularities, she said carefully. I reported them through the appropriate channels. Briggs and Voss. Ashworth's expression settled into something flat, and they were reviewed and resolved, according to administration. He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that meant he knew she was giving him the official version and was deciding whether to push past it. The delegate coming for this inspection, he said. I looked him up after the briefing. He has a more complex background than a standard federal health official. A lot of people in oversight positions have complex backgrounds. Nora. He said her name with a weight that stopped the deflection. I'm not asking you to brief me. I'm telling you that if something goes wrong during this inspection, medically, logistically, any other way, I want to know that the clinical response on this floor is being managed by someone who can handle it. She held his gaze. It is. He nodded once. Good. He started to walk away. Dr. Ashworth. He stopped. If something does go wrong, don't try to manage it alone. Get your patients to the safest part of the floor and stay there. He turned back slowly. Something in his face had shifted, not fear. He wasn't built for visible fear, but the adjustment of a person who had just received information that recalibrated the size of what they were dealing with. He nodded again and walked back toward his patients. The call came at 11:40. Not to her phone to the third-floor nurse's station. A landline transfer from the main switchboard, which Diane answered and then held out toward Nora with an expression that said the caller had asked for her by name. Nora took the handset. This is Mercer, Captain. The voice was male even, with the compression of someone speaking from a moving vehicle or an environment with background noise they were suppressing. We're 12 minutes out. The situation has developed. There is a third actor in the building we did not anticipate. He arrived this morning through the east entrance under a visitor registration. Checked in to see a patient on floor 4. Patient does not exist. He has been on the building's internal network since 9 a.m. She turned slightly away from the station, dropping her voice. What's his access? Unknown extent. We believe he's mapped the emergency alert system. If he triggers a full facility evacuation, it creates a movement window they can exploit during the confusion. The delegation security detail will follow evacuation protocol, and the delegate becomes exposed in the stairwell sequence. Process that in under 3 seconds. A staged evacuation. Pull the delegate out of the controlled conference room environment. Funnel him through a stairwell where protective positioning broke down and create a window in the chaos. The transmitter in the medication room, she said. Triggering mechanism. If he activates it, the fire suppression system on floors 2 and 3 gets a false positive signal. Sprinklers activate. Alarm escalates to full evacuation. We have people moving to the medication room now, but they're coming from outside the building. They won't make it in 12 minutes. A pause. No. She looked at the nurse's station. Diane was on the phone. Roy, who had stayed for an extended shift, was reviewing a chart. Down the hall, she could see the medication room door closed, the way it was supposed to be. I need to go, she said. She set the handset down. She walked to Diane and spoke quietly and directly. I need you to listen to me, and I need you to do exactly what I say without asking me to explain it right now. Diane turned from her phone with the sharp attention of someone who recognized urgency when it dropped its pretense. Move every patient who can be moved to the east side of the floor. Anyone who can't be moved, close their room doors and make sure they stay closed. Tell the staff to stay off the south corridor and away from the medication room. And call Ashworth. Tell him I said it's time. What is Minut's? Diane. She held her eyes. Please. Diane looked at her for 1 second. Then she picked up the phone. Nora walked to the medication room. She didn't have a weapon. She hadn't carried one in 3 years. That had been a condition she set for herself when she left, not a requirement anyone had imposed. She had a trauma pair of shears in her left pocket, a pen light, and 14 years of training in environments where improvisation was the primary skill. She pushed the medication room door open. The room was empty. She moved the crash cart in 4 seconds, crouched, and looked at the device on the baseboard. The indicator light was no longer dormant. It was cycling slow pulse, amber, the kind of pre-activation state that meant it had received an initiation signal and was running a countdown before full transmission. She had no idea how long the countdown was. She looked at the device without touching it. Matte casing, microantenna, adhesive mount. She had seen variants of this class of transmitter in a different context, and the design logic was consistent. The antenna was the vulnerable component, the part that, if physically disrupted, broke the transmission chain before the signal completed. The adhesive mount was industrial but not structural. The baseboard it was fixed to was standard drywall framing. She took the trauma shears from her pocket, opened them to their full extension, and used the flat of the lower blade as a lever between the device and the baseboard, working it slowly, applying even pressure. The adhesive resisted for 3 seconds and then released with a sound like tape coming off a surface, small, anticlimactic. She held the device in her palm. The light was still cycling, faster now. She needed to break the antenna without triggering the transmission force interruption, not completion. The antenna ran along the right edge of the casing, visible as a slight ridge under the matte finish. Press the flat of the shear blade across it at a perpendicular angle and applied direct downward pressure. Casing cracked. The light went out. She stood there for a moment, holding a broken piece of equipment in a medication room on the 3rd floor of a hospital in Eastern Oregon, and her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the particular physiological aftermath of adrenaline meeting controlled suppression over an extended period. She had not allowed herself to register the stress of the past 2 weeks in real time. It had been building in her body without her permission, and it was registering now in the tremor of her fingers, in the single, hard breath she pulled in and released slowly. She set the device on the medication cart, labeled it with a piece of surgical tape and a pen, "Do not touch," evidence, and walked out of the room. In the corridor, the floor had changed. Diane had moved with speed and precision that Nora had not fully anticipated. Patients were repositioned. Room doors were closed along the south side, and 2 nurses were directing a confused family group toward the east elevator bank. Ashworth was at the nurses' station, not panicking, not performing calm either, just standing with his hands on the counter and his eyes moving across the floor with the systematic assessment of a man identifying what needed to be managed. He saw her come out of the medication room. "Tell me," he said. "The evacuation alarm may still trigger from another source. If it does, do not move patients through the south stairwell." Stairwell or shelter in place? Is this a fire? No. Then I'm keeping my patients where they are. He said it without hesitation. The decisiveness of a man who had just decided which version of himself he was going to be in this situation. What else? "There's a man in this building who registered as a visitor on floor 4 this morning. He's not here to visit anyone. If you see someone who doesn't have a reason to be on this floor, call security and get between him and your patients." Ashworth straightened. "You should have told me earlier." "I know." She meant it. His jaw was tight. His controlled anger of someone who had just discovered that a situation had been larger than they'd been allowed to see. But he didn't spend time on it. He turned and walked back to his patients, pulled out her phone. 9 minutes had passed since the call. 3 since she'd broken the device. A new message, transmitter signal dropped 2 minutes ago. Was that you? She typed. Yes, device is secured. Third actor, where is he now? 40 seconds. Longer than any previous response. She was walking towards the south stairwell door when it came back. Lost him on floor 3. He came down from 6 minutes ago. He knows the transmitter failed. She stopped walking. She was 8 feet from the south stairwell door. It opened. The man who came through it was broad-shouldered and unhurried, in civilian clothes, with a visitor lanyard that hung at the wrong angle for someone who had put it on in a lobby and kept it on. He was mid-40s, with the specific physical stillness of someone trained to project neutrality as a default state. He looked at her, and his expression did not change. Neither did hers. They stood in the corridor and looked at each other, and the 4 feet of space between them was the kind of distance that, in a different context, had a different name entirely. Nurse, he said. His voice was flat, conversational. Wrong place to be standing. This is my floor, she said. He looked at her hands. She was holding the trauma shears at her side, closed, the way a person held something they were used to carrying. He clocked it, and his eyes came back to her face. You took something from the medication room, he said. I work in the medication room. Something shifted in his assessment of her, a microadjustment, the kind that happened when a person recalculated the threat level of whatever they were looking at. He took 1 step toward her. From the south end of the corridor, the stairwell door opened again. Not one person. 3, moving fast and quiet, in tactical gear, without insignia, the kind of gear belonged to people who did not announce their institutional affiliation in the field. The lead operator reached the man in the visitor lanyard before he completed his turn, and what followed was controlled and fast, and not particularly loud a containment, the kind that professionals executed, and civilians didn't fully process until it was already over. The man went down. The lead operator straightened and looked at Nora. He was younger than she expected, late 30s, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 2 days, and eyes that had the specific flatness of someone who had been awake for a long time doing difficult things. Nora Mercer, he said. She hadn't been called that in 3 years. The word landed in her chest at a frequency she had almost forgotten. Transmitter, she said. It's in the medication room. I disabled it, but the device is intact. You'll want it for forensics. Copy. He gestured to one of the other operators, who moved toward the medication room door. We have the building perimeter. Sutter is in custody on the ground floor. The van pair from last night are contained in the service corridor. He paused. The delegate is secure. He arrived early. We rerouted him as a precaution. She breathed. How early? He's been on the 8th floor since 9 this morning. She processed that. The inspection had been moved up, which meant someone on the protective side had made a decision without communicating it to her, and had the whole operation run 90 minutes later than it did, that decision would have been the one that mattered. There's something I need to tell you, she said, about the building, about who knew I was here before I arrived. The operator looked at her steadily. I know, he said. That's why we moved the timeline. Stared at him. Director Voss, he said. We've been building that piece for 6 weeks. We needed you in position to confirm the internal access points before we could move on him. He held her gaze. I'm sorry we couldn't tell you sooner. The corridor hummed with the low fluorescent constancy of the hospital around them. From down the hall, she could hear Diane's voice, calm, directing, managing the floor with the 22-year authority of someone who had navigated enough chaos to know what actually required her to raise her voice and what did not. Nora looked at the operator. Boss, she said. Yes. He knew I was coming before I arrived. Yes. Who else? The operator opened his mouth to answer. Behind him, from the stairwell, he and his team had come through. A sound came that had no business being in that context, not movement, not voices. The specific electronic 3-tone sequence of the hospital's emergency alert system initializing, not the transmitter she had disabled. A different trigger, from a different location. The operator spun toward the stairwell. His radio crackled, and a voice came through it that she could not make out clearly, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, clipped, the cadence of someone said something that had just gone wrong. She was already moving toward the east end of the floor, toward Ashworth, toward her patients. Because if the alert went full facility, the evacuation sequence would begin in 90 seconds, and the 8th floor, where the delegate had been sitting in a conference room since 9 that morning, where Harlan Voss also had his office, where the two of them had been in the same building for 3 hours without anyone on her floor, knowing it would become the most critical piece of real estate in Harlow Creek Medical Center. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out without stopping. The message was from a number she had never seen before, not the 3-digit contact, not the operator's radio channel, not anyone in her known network. 4 words, no signature. Voss is not alone. She didn't stop moving. The emergency alert tone cycled through its 3-beat initialization and then held not yet the full klaxon. Still in the warning phase, the system's way of telling itself it had received a trigger signal and was deciding whether to commit 90 seconds to full evacuation cascade. Maybe less if the secondary confirmation came through. She reached Ashworth at the nurse's station in 12 steps. Stairwell, she said. Now, take whoever you can move. He read her face and didn't ask questions. He turned and started moving down the hall, calling names, his voice carrying the particular authority of a doctor who had learned that in a genuine emergency the most useful thing he could do was sound like he expected to be obeyed. She went the other direction, towards the south end, toward the stairwell the operator had come through. The lead operator was at the door, radio at his ear, the other 2 members of his team flanking the contained 3rd actor, who was zip-tied and sitting against the wall with the expression of someone who had accepted the current situation without fully conceding the larger one. 8th floor, she said to the operator. Voss's office is on the 8th floor, and the delegate has been up there since 9. I know where the delegate is. The message said, Voss is not alone. If there's a 4th actor we haven't identified, and they're on the 8th floor, we have 2 people on 8. How many does Voss have? That landed. The operator pulled his radio up and spoke into it, clipped, directional, the kind of communication that conveyed maximum information in minimum words. The response that came back made his jaw tighten. He looked at her. One of ours on 8 is not responding. The alert tone shifted. The full klaxon hadn't triggered yet. But the initialization cycle had extended, which meant the system had received a second confirmation signal from somewhere in the building. Someone had found a backup trigger. Not the medication room device. She had broken that. Something else. Something she hadn't found. Because she hadn't known to look for it. Which part of 8? She said. Near the conference wing, where the delegate was sitting. Where Voss's office was. Where, if the klaxon went full facility, the evacuation protocol would send everyone through the stairwell sequence, and the controlled environment around the delegate would dissolve into exactly the movement window the operation had been designed to create. I need to go up, she said. Mercer, your people on 8 are down to 1, and you have a 4th actor unaccounted for, and the delegate has been in the same room for 3 hours, which means anyone who's been watching the building this morning knows exactly where he is. She held the operator's eyes. I know that building layout. I know where the blind spots are. Send me up. He was 20 seconds making the decision, which was 19 more than she would have taken in his position. But he was working with a chain of command she wasn't part of and protocols she couldn't see, and she understood that even as it cost them time. East stairwell, he said. Do not engage the 4th actor independently. You locate, you relay, you hold position. She was already moving. The east stairwell smelled like cleaning solution and the particular staleness of a high traffic shaft that got mopped twice a week and ventilated poorly. She took the stairs at a pace between walking and running, fast enough to cover floors quickly, controlled enough not to arrive on 8 breathless, and compromised. 4 flights. She counted them by the landing numbers, stenciled on the cinder block walls. She pushed through the door to 8. The 8th floor was administrative offices, conference rooms, the boardroom at the south end, a smaller meeting suite at the north. The corridor was carpeted in the institutional gray-blue that administration floors used to signal a different category of space than the clinical floors below. It was quieter up here, the ambient hospital noise reduced to a low hum, the lighting warmer and more deliberate. The operator's person was at the north end of the corridor, standing outside a closed door. Standing wrong weight on the right leg, left shoulder dropped, the posture of someone managing pain they were not going to announce. She moved toward him fast. He was young, late 20s, short hair, the kind of face that defaulted to neutral as a trained behavior. His left hand was pressed flat against his thigh, and she could see below the edge of his jacket that his tactical vest had sustained an impact on the lower left side. "How bad?" she said quietly. "Blunt." "No penetration," he exhaled carefully. "Guy came out of the boardroom before I cleared it. Got a chair across the ribs before I got him contained." "He's contained?" "Boardroom. Secured the door from outside." He shifted his weight. "Delegate is in the conference suite, 40 feet north. Voss is with him." She looked at the corridor. 40 feet of carpet and closed doors between her and the room where the delegate was sitting with a man who had spent 6 weeks running interference for an operation designed to kill him. "Who else is in the conference suite?" "Voss's executive assistant was in there when I last had visual. She left for the copy room about 20 minutes ago and hasn't come back." "The copy room is on this floor?" "South end." She thought about that. An assistant who left for a copy run 20 minutes ago and hadn't returned, on a floor that was now in pre-alert status, with a boardroom containing an incapacitated fourth actor and a conference suite 40 feet north containing the target and his host. "She's not in the copy room," Nora said. The operator's good hand moved to his radio. "Don't," she said. "If she hears radio traffic, she'll know the timeline has changed." "Where does the copy room connect?" "Interior hallway runs from copy room to the back of Voss's private office, and Voss's private office connects to the conference suite." He looked at her. Adjoining door. She was already moving south. She passed 4 closed office doors and a staff kitchen alcove before reaching the copy room at the end of the hall. The door was ajar. She pushed it open with 2 fingers. Empty. A copier running a job pages still feeding through, warm, a stack of output in the tray that no one had collected. The machine had been running unattended long enough that the tray was nearly full. The interior hallway the operator had described was a narrow connecting passage service width. No carpet, the utilitarian architecture of spaces that existed for function and not appearance. She moved through it slowly, keeping to the right wall, her footsteps deliberate on the hard floor. Voss's private office was dark. She could see that, through the gap at the bottom of the door, no light strip, blinds drawn, no movement visible through the narrow window panel beside the doorframe. She pressed her back against the wall beside the adjoining door, the one that connected to the conference suite, and listened. Voices. 2 of them. Voss and someone she didn't recognize, female, low, with the flattened affect of someone keeping their register controlled, not afraid. Working. She couldn't hear the delegate. Pulled out her phone and typed to the operator downstairs. 4th actor is a woman. In the conference suite now, via adjoining door from Voss office. Delegate's status, unknown, cannot hear him. She pressed send and waited, her back against the wall, and the voices filtering through the door, working through what she had. The alert tone downstairs was still in initialization. It hadn't gone full klaxon yet, which meant either the backup trigger hadn't fully activated, or someone had intercepted it. Either way, she had time. She didn't know how much, but some. The phone vibrated. Delegate has a medical condition, cardiac, controlled. Stress event could be dangerous, independent of physical threat. Do not let them know we're in the building until we have eyes on him. Stared at that for 2 seconds. A cardiac condition, controlled under normal circumstances. The kind of thing that became uncontrolled under sustained stress, and the delegate had been in a room with Harlan Voss for an indeterminate amount of time while the building around him moved toward crisis. She put the phone away. She pressed her ear closer to the door gap. Voss's voice, measured and careful. The review materials are being prepared. There's been a slight delay with the system's access. The woman's voice, quieter. From closer to the door, he needs water. Get him water. A chair, moving, footsteps. She stepped back from the adjoining door and moved to the main corridor entrance of the conference suite, the standard door, the one that opened from the 8th floor hallway. Tested the handle. Unlocked. She opened it. The conference suite was a long room with an oval table, 8 chairs, and windows along the east wall that let in the flat gray light of a February morning. Harlan Voss was at the side credenza with his back to the door, filling a glass from a pitcher. At the far end of the table sat a man in his mid-60s, compact, silver-haired, with the careful posture of someone managing discomfort they didn't want anyone to see. His face was pale in a way that had nothing to do with the lighting. Between Nora and the far end of the table, standing beside the delegate's chair with a phone in one hand and the precise physical readiness of someone who had made a decision they had not yet acted on, was a woman in her 40s, dark blazer. No Lanyard, the executive assistant, who had gone to the copy room 20 minutes ago and not come back. Everyone in the room looked at Nora. The woman's phone came up. "Don't," Nora said. Her voice was level. She was looking at the delegate. "Sir, my name is Nora Mercer. I'm on the clinical staff here. I need to know if you're all right." The delegate's eyes were clear, which was the first useful thing. Confusion would have suggested hypoxia or medication. Clarity meant he was present, processing, functional. "I've been better," he said. His voice was dry. Whatever was happening to him physically, he had decided to treat it with equanimity, which either meant he was tougher than his age suggested or he had been in rooms like this before. Voss turned from the credenza. He looked at Nora with an expression that moved through surprise and into something colder and more deliberate, the expression of a man recalculating, not conceding. "Ms. Mercer," he said. The administrative warmth was gone. What was underneath it was much simpler. "You should not be on this floor. The building is currently being secured by federal operatives," she said. "Dale Sutter is in custody on the ground floor. The man you had in the boardroom is contained. Team that came through the north entrance last night is in the service corridor." She kept her eyes moving Voss. "The woman, the delegate, the adjoining door. It's done." The woman took a step toward the delegate. Nora moved first. She crossed the distance in 3 steps and put herself between the woman and the delegate's chair, her back to the table, trauma shears in her right hand open and held low. Not a threat display, a tool's available posture, the kind that said she had made a calculation about what she was willing to do. "Stop," she said. The woman stopped. She was reading Nora the same way. Nora Pup was reading her threat assessment, option mapping, the rapid unconscious math of 2 people who had both done this before in some form or another. Whatever the woman saw in Nora's face made her take a half step back. Voss set the water glass down on the credenzas with a precise click. "You have no authority here," he said. "You're a staff nurse. You're not part of any operation I'm aware of, and you have no standing to." Director Voss, the delegate's voice, from behind her, still dry, still clear. "I think it might be best if you stop talking." Voss went silent. The main door opened behind Nora. The operator from downstairs, moving carefully with his damaged ribs, came through with 2 additional people she hadn't seen before, plain clothes, credentials already out, the kind of entry that was controlled and deliberate rather than tactical, the kind that happened when the physical threat had been downgraded and the legal component was becoming the operative concern. The woman in the blazer put her phone on the table and raised both hands without being told. Voss looked at the credentials. He looked at the people holding them. He looked at Nora, who was standing between him and the delegate with a pair of trauma shears and an expression that gave him nothing. "I want a lawyer," he said. "That's a reasonable request," one of the plainclothes people said, and moved toward him. What followed was not clean. It was never clean. Nora had been present at enough operational conclusions to know that the cinematic version, the moment of resolution, clear and decisive, everyone exactly where they were supposed to be, was a construction that happened in retrospect. In real time, it was logistics and communication failures, and people doing adjacent tasks in the same space without full information about what anyone else was doing. She stepped away from the delegate's chair and let the people with credentials manage the room. Her job at this point was the one that had always been her job, crouched beside the delegate. "Sir, I need to do a quick assessment. Can you tell me what you're feeling physically?" He looked at her with the appraising look of someone deciding whether to be honest. "Chest tightness. Started about 40 minutes ago. I've had it before, it's not new." "Are you on medication for it?" "Beta blocker. I took my morning dose." "Any radiation to the arm or jaw?" "No." "Shortness of breath?" "Some. Less than before." She took his wrist pulse check. 2 fingers, the same way she'd checked Gerald's on her first morning here. The monitor tells you the number, and the fingers tell you the quality. His rate was elevated but regular. No irregularity in the rhythm. Color in his face was improving from the flat pallor she'd seen when she came through the door. "The stress response is going to keep your rate up for a bit," she said. "That's normal. I'm going to get you properly assessed as soon as we have the floor cleared, but right now your presentation is consistent with situational stress and not with a cardiac event." She paused. "Can't tell you not to worry, but the numbers are okay." He looked at her for a moment. "You came through that door alone." "There were people coming behind me. You didn't know that when you opened it." She didn't answer because it was true, and she didn't see any value in confirming it out loud. "Nora Mercer," he said, reading her badge. "That's not the name they gave me for this operation." "I don't know what name they gave you." "No," he said. "I suppose you wouldn't." He looked at her steadily. "Thank you." She stood. "I'll get someone up here with a proper cardiac monitor. Don't stand up quickly." She walked out of the conference suite and into the hallway, where the operator with the damaged ribs was leaning against the wall, looking like a man fighting the urge to sit down. "He needs cardiac monitoring," she said. "Level 2 portable, not a pulse ox." "Who do you have?" "We have a medic in the building." "Get him up here." He got on the radio. She stood in the 8th floor corridor and looked at the door of Harlan Voss's private office. Through it, she could hear voices Voss and the plainclothes people, the low register of legal caution and institutional process, beginning to grind into motion. The sound of a man who had spent 6 weeks managing the appearance of a resolved situation, discovering that the situation had never been resolved, had in fact been collapsing around him, in full view of people he had dismissed as incapable of seeing it. She thought about the morning she was a nurse, and nurses' hands, ear and security was people specifically trained for that purpose. She felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction. It was adjacent to it, more like the specific, quiet sensation of having been right about something for long enough that being confirmed felt less like victory and more like relief. Conrad Briggs was arrested at 12:40 in the security office on the 1st floor. She wasn't there when it happened. She heard it from the operator relayed, secondhand, the kind of information that reached her in pieces over the following hour as the building situations resolved from crisis into containment, into the beginning of what would become a very long investigation. Briggs had known since the operation's first week. Not the full scope, he hadn't been a planner. He had been a facilitator, which in the legal sense would prove a distinction without much difference. He had received payment to ensure the internal vulnerabilities remained unaddressed. The badge reader, the contractor verification, the camera blind spots. He had reported Nora's concerns to Voss not out of administrative reflex, but because Voss had told him to monitor for anyone who noticed things they weren't supposed to notice. Cargo elevator log had been modified from a terminal in Briggs's office. When the plainclothes team walked into his office at 12:40, he was sitting at his desk with his hands folded on the surface and the look of a man who had spent the morning calculating his options and determined that he didn't have many. He did not argue. He asked once whether cooperating would affect the outcome. The answer he received was noncommittal in a way that was its own kind of answer. He put his hands out. Nora heard this from the operator while standing in the stairwell between floors in 3 and 4, the same landing where she had made every call she needed to make over the past 2 weeks. The cinder block wall and the fluorescent hum and the particular echo that turned this space into something close to private in a building full of people. Briggs, she said, and Voss, and the contractor network. Sutter was a subcontractor, 3 layers removed from the principals. We've been following the chain for 4 months. The operator paused. Your position here was identified as a likely insertion point 6 weeks ago. We needed someone who could operate inside the clinical environment without triggering the internal surveillance Voss had running. Your surveillance. One of several competing interests, yes. He said it with the flatness of someone who was not going to apologize for the operational reality. Photograph, she said. The one sent to me from the unknown number. Someone was running a 4th surveillance stream that you didn't control. We know. We're still working on that piece. She leaned against the wall. Stairwell hummed. Who sent me the 4 words? Voss is not alone. A pause. We don't know yet. She accepted that. Unknowns at the edge of resolved situations were common. They didn't always resolve themselves neatly. They didn't always pressure's operation, and the people who survived high-pressure operations were the ones who learned to hold uncertainty without letting it undo the clarity of what had been established. What had been established? The building was secure. The delegate was stable. The people who had structured this operation from inside Harlow Creek Medical Center were in custody or in the process of being taken there. She pushed off the wall and went back to her floor. The 3rd floor was running. Diane had managed it with the same unfussy authority she brought to everything, which was the authority of someone who had seen enough genuine emergencies to know which responses were useful and which were theater. Patients had been repositioned without incident. Staff had maintained their clinical function through the alert initialization and the subsequent confusion with a composure that spoke to the quality of the people Diane had built around her. Nora walked the floor from east to west, checking each patient, running assessments that were partly clinical and partly the specific attentiveness of a person coming down from extended adrenaline and needing to return to the granular work that had always been her actual job. Bed 7 was empty. Frank Odell had been discharged, while the 8th floor situation was still resolving a discharge that, she discovered from the notes, Ashworth had authorized at 11:15, early release with full home care protocol, ambulatory and stable. He had walked out of Harlow Creek Medical Center with his cracked ribs and his relocated shoulder and whatever he actually was, and he had left no contact information beyond the address on his intake form, which she would have bet considerable money was not an address that would produce him if someone went looking. She stood in the empty bed 7 space for a moment. He had given her the South Corridor reconnaissance observation on day 11. He had given her the electrical panel visit before 6 a.m. He had watched with the attention of someone who had a reason to watch, and he had chosen to share what he saw with her specifically, which meant he had made an assessment of her that preceded their first conversation. The unknown number, the photograph, the 4 words. She didn't have confirmation. She might never have it. But she filed the possibility away in the same place she kept other things she couldn't verify, not discarded, not relied on, just held. She smoothed the bed 7 sheet with one hand out of habit and moved to bed 8. 2:15, Ashworth found her at the nurse's station. He had the look of a man who had spent the last 3 hours being professionally functional in a situation he had not been fully briefed on, and was now in the position of either demanding an explanation or deciding whether the explanation would actually help him. He sat on this edge of the counter, which was something she had never seen him do. It made him look less like the attended and more like a person. The administrator, he said. Voss, in custody. Yes, for what, specifically? She looked at him, facilitating unauthorized access to a federal facility during a protected personnel visit, part I can tell you. The full charge list is going to take a while. He absorbed that. Briggs, also in custody. He was quiet for a moment. Around them the floor moved call bells, a medication cart, two nurses in a conversation that had nothing to do with anything that had happened today. The ordinary machinery of a hospital afternoon, indifferent to the morning it had come through. You knew, Ashworth said, before I ever pulled you into that hallway. Day 8, his jaw tightened. You were on this floor with my patients, yes. If something had gone wrong at the clinical level while you were managing whatever that was. It didn't. That's not an answer. She turned to face him directly. No, it's not. She let that sit. I caught the pulse and embolism. I caught your bed 9 overlap. I ran the neurochecks on 6 and 9 before you asked me to. My patients were covered. She paused. I was doing 2 jobs. I know what that sounds like. But the clinical work was not a cover story, it was the job. Both things were real. He looked at her for a long time. Ashworth at rest was still an assessor. He couldn't stop evaluating what was in front of him. It was the fundamental habit of a diagnostic mind's mind, and she could see him working through it. Clinical record against the operational reality, against the things she'd said in the hallway, about being overlooked, not always being a disadvantage. You should have told me, he said, finally. When I came to you this morning, if I had told you, you would have acted differently. Your behavior in that building for the next 3 hours would have changed. And someone was watching this floor. She held his eyes. Your natural reaction was the one that kept you and your patients safe. He was quiet again. She could see him deciding whether that was justification or rationalization, and landing somewhere in the uncomfortable middle where most real things lived. The inspection, he said. The actual one. Federal review. Rescheduled. The delegate is stable. It'll happen when it happens. And the hospital. He looked down the corridor, the length of the floor, the rooms, the staff. What happens to this hospital? It was a real question. Harlow Creek Medical Center had just had its director and security chief arrested, had been the site of an active infiltration operation, and was going to be under investigative review for the foreseeable future. Staff didn't know most of it yet. They would. New leadership, she said. Oversight. Probably an external administrative team while the investigation runs. She paused. Clinical operation doesn't stop. Your patients are still your patients. He nodded slowly. Then he stood, straightening back into the posture he was used to the attending, the senior presence, the man who had a floor to run. Mercer, he said. Yes. Whatever you were before this, I hope you stay here. He walked to his first patient. She looked at the nurse's station counter where he had been sitting and felt something she didn't have a clean name for, something between being seen and being tired. And then Diane came around the corner with a chart and a question about bed 10, and the afternoon moved forward the way afternoons did. At 4 o'clock, she was called to the 8th floor. Not by phone, a physical request, delivered by one of the plainclothes people who had been working Voss's office since noon. She followed him up in the elevator, and he led her past the conference suite door, open now, chairs pushed back, the physical evidence of a resolved situation, and into the boardroom at the south end, which had been converted into a temporary workspace. Laptops, cables, a printer running continuously. 2 people she didn't recognize working at the far end. The delegate was at the center table. He had been assessed by the medic, his cardiac presentation monitored and confirmed as stress reactive rather than event driven, and he looked better than he had in the conference suite. More color, more settled, particular composure of a person who had processed an adrenaline response and come out the other side. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. How much did they tell you, he said, about why you were specifically chosen for this insertion? Not much. That my profile fit the clinical environment and that I could operate without triggering internal surveillance. Both true. He folded his hands on the table. Also true, you reported irregular activity through proper channels in the first week, to Briggs, then to Voss. Both of them immediately escalated your presence to the operations principals. She had calculated this in the parking structure, the night of the photograph. They knew I was there before I arrived. But my reports confirmed I was actively looking. Yes, which accelerated our timeline. We had planned for a longer insertion window. Your reports forced the operation's hand. They moved the transmitter placement earlier than planned, which is why you found it when you did. He paused. You were not just a surveillance asset. You were, in effect, bait. We needed to know the exact location of their internal infrastructure, and the only way to surface it quickly, and the only inside was to put someone inside who would make them nervous enough to activate it. She held his gaze. You could have told me that. We could have. We chose not to, because an asset who knows their bait behaves differently from one who doesn't. She breathed slowly through her nose. The operational logic was sound. The human cost of it 2 weeks of moving through a building knowing she was exposed, but not knowing how completely was a different calculation that nobody had asked her to make. The photograph, she said. The 4 words. You still don't know who that was. We have a hypothesis. He looked at her carefully. Frank Odell. She kept her face still. He discharged this morning, before we had a chance to speak with him, the delegate continued. The intake address is a property registered to a holding company with 7 layers corp structure. His medical history, the ribs, the shoulder is consistent with someone who sustained those injuries in a field context rather than a domestic fall. He paused. We believe he was running an independent observation of the same operation from a parallel track that we were not aware of. Whose track? That, he said, is what we're still working on. She looked at the table. Frank Odell in bed 7, watching the south corridor from his imaging window, 12-minute interval between passes, same pace both times. The specific flatness of a man who had spent years evaluating people under pressure. The non-answer he had given her when she asked who he was. Yes, he had said. It is the woman, she said. The one in the blazer. Voss's assistant. Her name is not the name on her employee file. We're processing that. She looked up. How long has Voss been running this? 18 months, minimum. Possibly longer. He had assistants from within the hospital's administrative structure on at least 4 separate security-adjacent decisions over that period. Contractor approvals, camera system upgrade deferrals, badge, breast VIX, reader maintenance scheduling. The delegate's voice was level, but something underneath it had an edge she could hear. He was methodical. He was patient. And he was effective, right up until a nurse on her 3rd day noticed a badge reader flickering the wrong color. She said nothing. The investigation is going to be lengthy, he said. There will be depositions, testimony, a full review of the hospital's operational records over the past 2 years. Your cooperation will be requested. He paused. Your actual identity and background will be disclosed to the investigative team. I know. You've been carrying a cover for 3 years. Yes. Is there anything you need before that changes? She considered the question honestly. The apartment with nothing on the walls. Car she'd chosen because it was common enough to disappear in traffic. The reference letter from a clinic in Montana. The 3-digit contact she had texted at a number she might never use again. No, she said. I don't think so. He nodded. He seemed satisfied with the answer, or at least to have expected it. He stood, and she stood, and he extended his hand across the table the way people did when they wanted an exchange to have the weight of formality without the performance of ceremony. She shook it. One more thing, he said, and his voice shifted slightly, not softer, exactly, but different. Less official. The charge nurse on the 3rd floor. Pollard. Diane. She managed an emergency protocol this morning with no briefing, incomplete information, and a floor full of patients, and she did it in a way that kept every one of those patients safe. He looked at her steadily. So did you. But she didn't know what she was doing it for. Nora looked at him. Make sure she knows, he said, that it mattered. She took the elevator back down to 3, and when the doors opened and the floor came back into view the nurse's station, the corridor, the call bells, the particular fluorescent constancy of a department that had come through a difficult morning and was simply continuing to function. She stood in the elevator doorway for 1 moment longer than necessary. Then she stepped out. Diane was at the nurse's station, reading glasses down on her face for once, working through end-of-shift paperwork with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. She looked up when Nora approached. "How's the 8th floor?" Resolved. "Good." Diane went back to her paperwork. Then, without looking up, someone from administration called. "They're sending an interim director. Starting tomorrow," I heard. A pause. Diane set her pen down. "Are you going to tell me what actually happened today?" Nora looked at her. Diane looked back, the reading glasses, making her look slightly less formidable than she normally did, which was still considerably formidable. "Some of it," Nora said. "When I'm cleared to." Diane picked her pen back up. "Fine," she wrote a line. "You should know that when you told me to move the patients this morning, I didn't ask you why." "I know. I noticed. I've been doing this for 22 years. She didn't look up. "I know when someone in front of me knows what they're talking about." Nora stood at the nurse's station for a moment, the afternoon running around them, and felt the particular weight of being recognized by someone who had no reason to extend that recognition, and had done it anyway, without announcement, without ceremonies, and because it was simply true. "Diane," she said, what you did this morning mattered. Moving those patients, managing the floor the way you did it was exactly right, and it kept people safe." Diane was quiet for a moment. She kept writing. Then she said, gruffly, without looking up, "I know that." But something in her shoulders shifted slightly. Nora went to check her patients. She was in bed 10, assessing post-procedural drainage, when her phone vibrated. Unknown number. Not the 3-digit contact. Not the delegate. Not the operator. She opened the message. No text. Just a photograph taken from a distance. Poor angle, clearly a mobile shot from a moving vehicle. The subject was a parking structure, shot through a windshield. 3rd level. A support column. The parking space behind it. The space where she had parked her car the night before, watching the north service entrance. She stared at the image for a long moment. Then a second message arrived from the same number, and this one had words. "You were never as invisible as you thought. Neither was Voss. There are more of them, Mercer. This hospital was one node. I'll be in touch when it's safe." She stood in bed 10 with the phone in her hand and the patient asking her a question. She answered automatically and correctly, and her mind was somewhere else entirely running backward through the 18 months of Voss's operation. 4 layers of corporate structure on Franco Dell's holding company, the 4th surveillance stream that the delegates' team hadn't controlled and forward through what a node implied. A network. Not a single operation. Not finished. She finished the bed 10 assessment. She noted the drainage volume, adjusted the dressing, told the patient he was progressing swollen, which was true, and she said it because it was true, not because the situation around her required any particular performance of normalcy. She walked to the supply room, stood inside it with the door closed, and read the message 3 more times. "There are more of them, Mercer. This hospital was one node." She thought about what a node meant in operational terms. A node was a point of function within a larger system, not the origin, not the terminus, but a location where multiple lines of activity intersected and were managed. One node implied others. Others implied coordination at a level that made Harlan Voss look like middle management, which she was beginning to understand was exactly what he had been. She thought about the 18 months of patient, methodical preparation she had seen evidence of inside this building. Contractor network, the internal surveillance, the careful cultivation of a security chief who would look the wrong direction on request. That kind of infrastructure did not get built for a single operation targeting during a single delegate, during a single inspection visit. It got built for repeated use. She put the phone in her pocket. She stood in the supply room for 30 more seconds, long enough to make a decision she had been circling for 3 years without landing on, and then she walked out and went back to her patients, because her patients were her patients regardless of everything else, and that had always been the one thing that was fully and simply true. The next 4 days were the kind of days that got described afterward as complicated and felt, while they were happening, like a sustained, controlled demolition of every structure she had spent the past 3 years building around herself. The cover dissolved in stages. First, to the investigative team, 2 federal agents and a lawyer who came to the hospital on the morning after and sat with her in a conference room on the 6th floor for 4 hours. She answered their questions accurately and completely, which was the only mode she had ever been able to sustain for extended periods. They were professional and thorough, and one of them, the lawyer, asked the same question in 3 different formulations before accepting that she was going to give him the same answer each time. Her real file was accessed. The actual one, not the Montana Clinic version. Combat medic, 8 years of service, 3 overseas deployments, 2 commendations she had never mentioned to anyone, a classified incident in the 4th year that had resulted in a medical separation that was filed under terms she was still not at liberty to describe in full. The investigative team read it and asked their questions, and she watched them recalibrate, one by one, the way Ashworth had recalibrated, the way the operator had looked at her in the corridor, that particular adjustment that happened when a person discovered that what they were looking at was significantly larger than the frame it had been presented in. She had never enjoyed that moment. It had always felt more like a loss of something than a gain. On the 2nd day, the interim administrative director arrived. Her name was Patricia Wohl, 60, and she had the immediate practical efficiency of someone who had been deployed into institutional crises before and had learned that the first 24 hours were about establishing function, not understanding everything that had failed. She toured the building with 2 staff members, held a brief all-hands in the main atrium that hit the necessary note stability, continuity, accountability without overpromising any of them, and by the end of her first afternoon had identified 3 additional administrative gaps that nobody had flagged during the Voss tenure. She found Nora at the nurses' station on the 3rd floor at the end of that first day. "Mercer," she said, reading the badge, "you're the one who initiated the floor protocol Tuesday morning. Diane Pollard managed the floor protocol. I gave her the trigger." Patricia Wohl looked at her with the measuring assessment of someone who had handled enough people to recognize when one of them was deflecting credit and why. "I've read the preliminary investigative summary. Your name comes up considerably." "I imagine it does. Are you planning to stay on this floor?" Nora looked at the corridor, the nurses' station, the call board, the familiar geography of a place she had inhabited for less than 3 weeks, and somehow knew better than anywhere she had lived in the past 3 years. "That depends on whether the hospital is keeping me." "The hospital is keeping you," Patricia Wohl said, with a flatness that indicated this had already been decided and was not a discussion. "I'm asking if you want to stay." Nora looked at her. "Yes." "Good." She wrote something on the clipboard she was carrying. "There's going to be a full security review of this building starting next week. Interim security director will want to consult with you. I'll make myself available." Patricia Wohl moved on to her next item. She was not a warm person, but she was a functional one, and in a building that had just lost its director to a federal arrest, functional was what the situation required. On the 3rd day, Harlan Voss was formally charged. The charges were read in a federal district court in the city and covered a list that the investigative team had been building across 18 months of work that Nora had known nothing about when she arrived. Conspiracy to compromise a protected federal operation, facilitation of unauthorized building access, obstruction of a federal security review, misuse of a position of institutional authority. The list ran to 11 counts, and each count represented a specific documented action, a contractor approval, a camera upgrade deferral, a security report that had been received and deliberately suppressed. She was not in the courtroom. She heard about it from the operator, who sent her a message that said only charges filed. 11 counts. Briggs pled this morning. Full cooperation. Briggs had cooperated immediately and completely, the way people cooperated when they had been caught so thoroughly that partial disclosure was no longer a viable strategy. His cooperation had provided the investigative team with documentation they had been missing: internal communications, financial, the timeline of every decision he had made at Voss's direction over the preceding 14 months. Including the documentation of the morning, he had received Nora's first report about the badge reader and the cargo elevator and the contractor with the mismatched credential, and had walked directly to Voss's office, rather than conducting any verification. That documentation was entered into the federal record. She read the summary the following morning, sitting at the kitchen table of her apartment in the early light before her shift. The apartment still had nothing on the walls. She had been thinking about that, what to put there, whether to put anything, what it would mean to make a decision about that in this particular location. She hadn't resolved it yet. She drank her coffee and read the summary, and felt the particular heaviness of seeing something confirmed in formal language that she had known empirically for weeks. Confirmation wasn't the same as resolution. It didn't undo the 2 weeks she had spent in that building, carrying information she couldn't share, managing 2 jobs with no margin for error in either of them, told professionally and courteously on 2 separate occasions by 2 separate men that she was out of her lane and should return to the work that matched her title. She thought about the word nurse, the way Voss had said it, the way Briggs had heard it and used it, the way it had functioned in that building as a category designed to define the outer limit of what she was permitted to notice. She finished her coffee. She put the mug in the sink. She went to work. The thing about Diane Pollard was that she processed information the way she processed everything, thoroughly, without drama, on her own schedule. On the 4th day after the incident, she arrived at the shift handoff and worked through the morning with her usual comprehensive efficiency. At 10:30, during a quiet interval at the nurse's station, she set her pen down and looked at Nora directly. "Army," she said. "Yes, combat, attached to evacuation units." Diane absorbed this. "How long?" 8 years. A pause. "And then Montana?" "And then Montana." Nora met her eyes. "Clinic in Montana was real. I worked there for 8 months. The rest of the file was constructed. By the people who sent you here." "Yes." Diane was quiet for a moment. She picked up her pen. "Caught the pulse and embolism on your 2nd day, 3rd. Right." She wrote something in the chart she was holding. "You were running an operation inside my department. Suts. I was also doing the job. Both things were real." Diane looked up. Her expression was not warm, and it was not cold. It was the expression of a woman who had spent 22 years developing a precise instrument for evaluating what wasn't in front of her and was using it now. "I know," she said. "I watched you." She looked back down at her chart. "That's why I added you to the inspection briefing." Nora paused. "You already suspected something." "I suspected you were more than your file said. I didn't know what more meant." Diane wrote another line. "When you told me to move the patients Tuesday morning, I didn't ask why, because I had been watching you for 2 weeks, and I knew you wouldn't say something like that without a reason that outweighed my need for an explanation." Nora looked at the counter. "That was a significant amount of trust to extend to someone you'd known for 2 weeks. 22 years in trauma nursing," Diane said. "You learn to read the people around you or you don't last." She closed the chart. "You read correctly?" "So did I." She stood and picked up the next chart. "Don't make it strange, Mercer." Nora almost smiled. Almost. Marcus Ashworth requested a meeting with her on the 5th day. Not at the nurse's station, he left a note in her locker, written on the back of a prescription pad sheet, the way physicians of a certain generation still communicated when they wanted to say something they weren't ready to say in front of other people. "Conference room B, noon if available." She was available. He was already there when she arrived, standing at the window with his coffee, looking at the city in the way people looked at things when they were thinking about something else entirely. He turned when she came in. "I want to say something, and I want to say it without it becoming a longer conversation than it needs to be," he said. "Okay. I've spent 5 days reviewing every clinical interaction we had over the past 3 weeks. Every catch, every flag, every assessment." He set his coffee down. The work was real. I want you to know that I know that. You weren't using the clinical work as a performance or a cover. You were doing both things fully. I was. I know. He paused. I also want to say that when I came to you in the hallway on the morning of the incident, when I told you I'd noticed irregularities and was asking if you had too, I was giving you an opening. I thought I was being perceptive. Something shifted in his face. You were 3 steps ahead of me and had been for 2 weeks, and you couldn't tell me. And I want to say that I understand why, and I'm not holding it against you, even though my first instinct was to. She looked at him. Marcus Ashworth, 5 days past an event that had rearranged his understanding of his own department, and the person he had been working beside, was standing in a conference room telling her something that had clearly cost him some effort to arrive at. He was not a man who found it easy to say he had been behind. The fact that he was saying it anyway was, she thought, more than most people would have managed. Thank you, she said. Don't mention it. He picked up his coffee. Quality Committee is meeting next week to review the security upgrade proposals that Voss tabled last quarter. I'm going to need someone with specific expertise to present the clinical access control piece. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. That would be you. I'm a floor nurse. You're a floor nurse who identified 4 active security vulnerabilities in her first week and was correct about all of them. He raised an eyebrow. The committee doesn't need to know everything. They need to know everything. They need to know vulnerabilities were and what the corrective measures should be. You're the most qualified person in this building to tell them that. She considered it. What time? Tuesday, 9 a.m. He moved toward the door. Bring the badge reader thing. They'll want specifics. He left. She stood at the conference room window for a moment, looking at the same city view he'd been looking at when she came in, and thought about specifics. The badge reader flickering yellow on day 3. The cargo elevator log she had memorized from a corkboard in an open doorway. The contractor file she had printed and folded and kept in her pocket for 8 days, while 2 men told her, with professional courtesy, that it had been reviewed and resolved. Specifics. She had plenty. Public accounting of what had happened at Harlow Creek Medical Center began to surface in pieces over the following 2 weeks, the way these things always did, not as a single revelation, but as an accumulation, each piece landing in the public record with enough detail to be understood and enough redaction to protect the operational elements that still mattered. The charges against Voss made the regional news first. 14 counts by the time the full indictment was filed. The additions coming from Briggs's cooperation and the subsequent audit of administrative records going back 22 months. The reporting was factual and precise, covering the contractor network, the internal surveillance, the systematic suppression of security reports, the financial payments routed through a vendor relationship that had been established specifically for that purpose. The reporting did not name Nora Mercer. Her involvement was referenced as a clinical staff member who reported security concerns through internal channels and subsequently assisted federal operatives in securing the building. The language was accurate and deliberately minimal, which was exactly what she had asked for when the investigative team gave her the choice. She did not want to be the story. She wanted Voss to be the story, and Briggs and the contractor network, and the 18 months of deliberate institutional corruption that had turned a public hospital into an operational asset for people who had decided that the safety of a protected official was a problem they could exploit for purposes she still didn't fully understand and might not for a long time. She wanted the story to be about a system that had been used against the people it was supposed to protect, and about the way that kind of corruption required the active cooperation of people in positions of trust, and about what it cost when those people chose convenience and payment over the function they had accepted responsibility for. That was the story. She was just the person who had been in the building when it mattered. She read the first news article on her phone during a break, sitting in the hospital atrium, tasting, with a sandwich she was not particularly tasting, and she felt the specific quiet of a person who has carried a weight for long enough that setting it down doesn't doesn't feel like relief so much as a readjustment to a different kind of gravity. A family walked past her, a woman with 2 children, one in a stroller, navigating the atrium toward the elevator bank. The older child, a girl of about 5, was clutching a get-well card she was clearly transporting with great seriousness, holding it with both hands, focused on keeping it flat and undamaged. The mother was carrying everything else and managing the stroller and asking the older child to please stay close, and the whole small scene had the particular texture of ordinary life that hospitals concentrate people in the middle of something difficult, doing the next necessary thing. Watch them reach the elevator. Nora watched the button carefully, pressed the button carefully, checked that the card was still undamaged, and looked up at her mother for confirmation that she had done it right. Her mother told her she had. Nora folded her phone and went back to her floor. 3 weeks after the incident, she received a formal request from the oversight body that the delegate represented. It was delivered through the investigative team as a written communication on official letterhead, and it was a job offer. Not a return to field operations, a different category of work entirely. A newly structured position within the body's internal security review function focused on identifying institutional vulnerabilities in federally affiliated healthcare facilities. The position would use her clinical background, her operational experience, and the specific skill set she had demonstrated over the preceding 3 weeks. It was well-resourced, well-compensated, and came with the kind of institutional backing that her work inside Harlow Creek had been conspicuously lacking. She read the offer twice, sitting in her apartment at the table where she'd been eating breakfast every morning for 3 weeks and where there was still nothing on the walls. She wrote a response that evening, handwritten on the notepad she kept beside the coffee maker, transferred it to the formal reply form, and sent it back through the following morning. The answer was no. Not because the work wasn't meaningful. It was meaningful, and she could see exactly how her particular combination of skills would fit it, and there had been a version of herself, previous chapter of her life, who would have said yes without hesitation. But that version had made a different set of calculations about what she owed the world and what she owed herself, and those calculations had changed over 8 years, and 2 deployments, and a classified incident, and 3 years of rebuilding from the inside out. What she had found at Harlow Creek Medical Center, not the operation, not the infiltration, not the outcome, was that the work of caring for people in their worst moments was not a lesser version of something else. It was not a cover story. It was not a placeholder while she waited to return to the thing she was actually built for. It was the thing she was built for, and she had been inside it fully for 3 weeks. And she was not ready to leave it. She was not ready to leave this floor. The reply she sent said, with the formal courtesy, the communication required that she was grateful for the offer and declined it, and that she hoped to be useful to the oversight body in an advisory capacity if her expertise was needed, but that her primary professional commitment was clinical. She sent it and made more coffee and thought about the walls. She drove to a hardware store that evening after her shift and bought 3 things: a level, a box of picture hooks, and a small framed print she had seen in a shop window. The previous week, a topographic map of a landscape she had never visited. All elevation lines and contour intervals, the land described from above. She hung it above the kitchen table, checked the level twice, and stood back and looked at it. It was slightly crooked. She adjusted it. Still slightly crooked. She left it. The quality committee meeting on Tuesday ran 40 minutes. She presented the security access analysis with a directness that made the committee members, who had come in expecting a general overview, lean forward in their chairs about 8 minutes in. She named the specific vulnerabilities, the specific failures of process, and the specific corrective measures that would address each one with cost estimates she had put together with the interim security director over the previous week. She did not editorialize. She did not perform outrage. She presented the facts in order and let the facts carry the weight they carried. When she finished, the committee chair, a physician, named Doctor. Emmett, who had been on the quality committee for 11 years and had the look of someone who had sat through a great many presentations and found most of them adequate, looked at her for a long moment. "You put this together in a week," he said. "I had notes from earlier in my tenure. Earlier in you've been on staff for less than a month." "Yes." He looked at the other committee members. He looked back at her. "How soon can the badge system be upgraded?" "The vendor has a lead time of 2 weeks on the hardware. Installation can run concurrently with the contractor audit, which Patricia Wohl has already approved. Camera coverage gaps on floors 2 and 3 can be addressed immediately with repositioning of existing units, no new hardware required. And the contractor credential verification process needs to go through the licensing body, not the vendor. Every credential, every renewal, the vendor confirmation process Briggs was using had a single point of failure that was deliberately exploited. Cross-verification eliminates that. Dr. Emmett wrote something. "I want a full implementation proposal by end of next week. You'll have it Thursday." He looked up. Something in his expression shifted the same recalibration she had seen in Ashworth, in Diane, in the delegate, in each person who had encountered the full scope of what she had brought to this building and found that the frame they'd been given at the start was considerably too small. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "we should have had you on this committee from your first week." She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said, "you should have." The directness of it landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Dr. Emmett nodded a single, deliberate nod, the kind that acknowledged something rather than just responding to it, and moved to the next agenda item. 4 weeks after the incident, the third floor returned to something like itself. Not the same wasn't available. The same belt had been built on a foundation that turned out to be compromised, and the honest version of moving forward acknowledged that rather than papering over it. But the clinical work resumed its rhythm. The staff settled into the new administrative structure with the adaptive practicality of people who had learned that institutions were not the thing they were working for, and the days accumulated the way did in hospitals, each one dense with the specific weight of other people's crises, which had a way of keeping your own in proportion. She worked her floor. She caught things. She said what she saw. Nobody told her to stay in her lane. Ashworth had stopped, including the name of his medical school in his introductions, which she was fairly sure nobody else had noticed, and which she noticed without comment. Diane remained Diane undemonstrative, precise, managing the floor with 22 years of institutional knowledge and a standard that she applied to herself before she applied it to anyone else. Roy, who had extended his shift on the morning of the incident and kept the night handoff clean under conditions he didn't fully understand until afterward, told her one afternoon that he'd put in for the charge nurse certification exam. "Good," she said. "Diane thinks I'm ready. If Diane thinks you're ready, you're ready." He smiled at that and went back to his chart. Small things. They added up. The delegate visited the hospital in the 5th week as part of the rescheduled facility review. He arrived without advance announcement to the clinical staff, with 2 members of his team and a security detail that was visible but not intrusive, and he conducted the review with the thoroughness that the original visit had been designed for. He found Nora on the 3rd floor at mid-morning. She was in the corridor, outside bed 9, reviewing post-procedure vitals, when she became aware of him approaching from the east end of the hall. He was in a dark suit and looked better than he had in the conference suite. More color, steadier, the cardiac incident behind him in the way that experiences get behind you when you process them and commit to the processing. "The review is going well," he said when he reached her. "I heard you spent 40 minutes with the new security director. This morning. He's thorough." A pause. "You declined the offer." "I did." He looked at the corridor around them, the call board, the nurse's station, Diane at the far end speaking with a family, the ordinary controlled motion of a working floor. "You're certain?" "Yes." "May I ask why?" She thought about how to say it accurately. Not the easy version, the one that was technically true, but missed the weight of it, but the real one. I spent 8 years in environments where the work was consequential and invisible, she said. And then 3 years in environments where the work was visible and I was invisible. And what I found here on this floor with these patients is that the work of keeping people alive in the hardest moments of their lives is consequential, regardless of whether anyone sees it. She paused. I was trained to believe that the bigger the operation, the more it mattered. I think that was wrong. I think it matters here. He looked at her for a long moment. He was not a sentimental man, she had read that about him in the first minutes of their meeting in the conference suite, but something in his expression had the quality of genuine consideration, kind that happened when a person heard something that reorganized a belief that they hadn't known they were carrying. The offer stands, he said, whenever you want it. I know. She meant it as acknowledgement, not as a door left open. He nodded. He started to move toward the elevator, then stopped. The man in bed 7, he said. Frank Odell. She waited. We found the holding company. 7th layer of corporate structure, registered in a jurisdiction that makes full disclosure unlikely in any near-term time frame. He looked at her. We don't know who he was working for. We may not find out. I know. That doesn't concern you? She considered it honestly. Concerns me. I'm not sure what to do with the concern yet. That's a reasonable position. He paused. If he contacts you again, I'll be in touch. He accepted that and moved toward the elevator. She watched him go and thought about Frank Odell, who had watched a south corridor from a window with cracked ribs and a relocated end shoulder for what he saw, because he had decided she was the right person to tell. She thought about what it meant to operate from a parallel track, without the institutional backing or the visible authority, on information you couldn't fully disclose to anyone who might have used it. She had done that for 3 weeks. She understood it better than she wanted to. On the last day of her first month at Harlow Creek Medical Center, she stayed after her shift to finish the security implementation proposal for the quality committee. The floor had quieted to its evening rhythm, the particular combination of routine and readiness that a night shift produced, the building at its lower register, but not its lower guard. She was at the nurse's station with her laptop when Diane came by on her way out. Diane stopped. She looked at the screen, at the proposal taking shape, at the woman who had come to this floor less than a month ago with a reference letter from a clinic in Montana and had spent that month doing more than one job and doing both of them fully. Go home, Mercer, she said. 20 more minutes. You've been here since 6 this morning. The Thursday deadline is real. Diane put on her coat. She was quiet for a moment, doing up the buttons the way she did everything thoroughly, without rushing. Then she said, without looking up from the buttons, the staff trust you. Nora looked up. Not because of what happened, because of how you work, because you see them and you see the patients, and you don't use one as an excuse to neglect the other. Diane finished the last button. That's not nothing. I know. Good. She picked up her bag. 20 minutes. She left. Nora looked at the screen. Security proposal, half finished, the specific language of corrective measures and implementation timelines, and the kind of institutional accountability that did not resolve everything, but made certain failures harder to repeat. She thought about the badge reader, flickering yellow on day 3, and Travis telling her he'd get to it when he got to it, and what it had meant that nobody else had stopped to ask when. She thought about the morning she had walked into this building for the first time and been processed in under an hour by a woman who never looked up from her screen. She thought about the things that got missed when the people in a position to see them decided that seeing was someone else's job. That was the mechanism. She had come to understand. Not malice. Most of the time, just the comfortable decision that the concerning thing was probably nothing, that the gap in the record was probably a data entry error, that the nurse who was asking questions she didn't seem qualified to ask was probably out of her lane and should be told so. The mechanism was ordinary. It ran on reasonable-sounding justifications and institutional inertia and the low-grade human preference for problems that resolved themselves over problems that required someone to stand up and say what they actually saw. She had stood up. not because she was certain, not because she had authority, not because anyone in that building had given her reason to believe they would listen. She had stood up because the alternative, because lowering her head and returning to her patients, and deciding that the badge reader and the elevator, log, and the man who knew where the stairs were all someone else's. Problem was not something she was able to choose. Some people were built that way. She had spent a long time wishing she wasn't, and she had arrived somewhere in the past month at the understanding that the wishing was the waste. The building was the thing. What you did with it was the thing. She finished the proposal at 33 minutes past her self-imposed deadline, saved it, and closed the laptop. The floor hummed around her, the night shift running its steady, competent course. Through the window at the north end of the corridor, she could see the parking structure, the sodium lights, the city beyond it, in its familiar, dim orange. She picked up her bag and walked to the elevator. In the elevator going down, she stood with her back against the wall and thought about the topographic map hanging slightly crooked above her kitchen table, and the coffee she would make tomorrow morning, and the shift that would begin at 6, and the patients who would need her to see them clearly and act on what she saw. She thought about being a nurse in a building where no one had expected a nurse to matter. She thought about what it meant to do the work that was in front of you fully, without waiting for someone to confirm that the work was significant enough to deserve your full attention. It was always significant enough. The elevator opened at the ground floor. She walked through the lobby and out into the February evening, and the air was cold and real, and she pulled her jacket closed and walked toward her car, and the building stood behind her in the dark with its lights on across all 12 floors. All 430 beds, doing what it was built for, which was keeping people alive in the hardest moments of their lives. One careful, unflashy, unwitnessed act at a time. That was the work. She had always known how to do it. She just hadn't known until now that knowing was enough.